All right. Hello everyone, and welcome to the strategic design presentation. This is a presentation I'm hoping to give once a year, and it'll basically cover how the game rules and how the strategy of a game affects what decisions you make in your season, going into how it affects your design and how your functions that you decide to do on the robot will iterate over time. So a little bit about the people who made this presentation. It's a bunch of alumni and Mr. Hashiro, basically. So I'm Khan. I'm gonna be basically mainly presenting this, but I had a lot of help from Holden, Mr. Hashiro, and Kai, as well as 1678, Austin Haddocks, Adam Hurd from 254, Jared Russell from 254, and Tyler Holtzman from 2056 as well. The overall philosophy of this presentation series is the fact that we believe, three main principles that go into your performance in the season. And the first one is strategic design. So this is what we're covering right now. This is how do you approach the game strategically within your limits, and how do you choose, what functions you're going to prioritize, and how do you decide what your approach is. The second one is your design execution. So this is pretty much all the technical sub-themes. This is how you actually implement whatever you decide on, and how do you bring that robot to life. And the third thing is operator expertise. So the most obvious example of it is the drive team, but a lot of it is your driver practice and how you validate and verify your functions work ahead of competition. This graph on the right, you can kind of see how if you have this blue line as your max robot scoring potential, your actual scoring output is only ever going to relate to your driver skill and your capability. So you can have the best designed robot, but if those goals weren't right for your team, you're not going to be able to execute it well. And similarly, even if you have the best built robot, if you don't give it enough time to for your drivers to get practice on it, it's not going to operate well on the field as a robot that might not have as many functions or might not have as many capabilities, but the drivers have practiced well with it. That's going to perform better on the field. The four main principles we want to keep in mind is we always want to compete at maximum efficiency. So that means making the best use of your time you have at competition and before to make sure you're outputting, you're putting your best foot forward. The second thing is that smart game analysis is the most important thing that leads to informed design choices. And so when you look at robots, the first thing I want everyone to think about is why did they choose this function, or what led them to decide on this, because that's going to determine the approach that team had going into the robot design. The third thing is iterative design is great. Basically, iterative design basically means you don't try to design all your features at once and build everything all at once. You try to keep it modular so that you can build on your robot as you go on. You have something to work off of, and it allows you to get something out there so that you can test and start getting something working. This makes sure that if something doesn't work, you can find out earlier on and make that decision a lot quicker. The last thing, which is probably the most important, is that every action you do during a season has an opportunity cost. So opportunity cost basically means if you're doing something, then that's something else that you're not doing. This could, even just be something simple like, oh, I'm not working on the intake design today, even though I'm in charge of the intake because I'm helping my friend on the elevator. Well, that means the elevator might get started quicker or finished quicker, but the intake design isn't moving along, right? And then as an overall thing, you're always costing driver practice time. So as soon as you get a drivetrain out and you don't put mechanisms on there or whatever it is, driver practice time is limited. You have limited time in your season, and so you're always trying to maximize the driver practice time you have. The five main sections we're going to be going over is scoring systems, game features, field-centric analysis, strategic dependencies, and function iteration. I'm gonna pause between each one to take questions. So, yeah. And then the second note is a lot of these examples I'm gonna show today are going to reference robots and games from the past. And if you're not familiar with it, that's okay. I'll give a short description for each one, but Holden's going to do a presentation in a week or two, talking about the history of FRC and the different games we've had, and he'll go more in depth into it. So watch out for that one. If this presentation's examples are too confusing, because you don't know all these games very well, that's okay. Try to follow along, ask questions, and then go back and watch Holden's game history, and then come back to this one and rewatch the recording to get a deeper understanding of the examples and my explanations. So starting off, we're going to talk about scoring limits. So scoring limits is, we're going to be talking about how games are scored. And so scoring limits, the first thing that comes to mind, right? There's two main types. It's capped and not capped, or unlimited. So the unlimited is simple. There's an unlimited number of points you can get in the game. So games like 2022 or 2020, where you can infinitely pretty much keep scoring. Capped games, there's basically two types. So the first type is zero sum. Zero sum means, if you've heard of a zero sum game, that means there's a total number of maximum points that you can get across both alliances. And so, or in the game. One example is in 2018. 2018, the scoring system was basically, you have these scales. There's a small scale on both sides of the field, and then in the middle there's one large scale. And if it's tipped towards your side, then you're getting points for however many seconds it's tipped towards your side. And if it's not tipped, then you don't get points. So in that model, if the scale is not tipped towards you, then they're scoring, or I guess both teams aren't getting points. But the easier way to think about it is, if you're scoring, then they're not scoring, or they're not scoring as much. And so that kind of game will lead to a way different strategy compared to a game like 2020 or 2022, where it's just who can score the most. Another example is in 2015, where there was a maximum score you can get across both alliances, and so it was always who has more than 50% of the total score. In both of these games, and if next year's game is something similar to this, the thing I want you guys to think about is the focus is on being first. So in 2018, you want to be the first to tip the scale. In 2015, you want to be the first to do these actions. You want to be the first to get these cans in the middle, etc. The second type of a capped scoring game is equal opportunity games. So equal opportunity games means there's a max number of places to score. In 2023, before the championship update of Supercharge, there was a maximum number of places you can score on the grid. And then in 2019, which is this game right here, there were these orange balls and these yellow discs, and there was a set number of places you could score in these little rockets. So there were 2 rockets, and then this cargo bay in the middle. There was a set number of places you can score. And so in these games, the tiebreaker becomes fouls and how well you execute how you score, right? Obviously, if you don't get to the maximum score, that's not going to happen. But once you get to that high level where both teams are vying for that maximum, a lot of it's going to come down to fouls and penalties. Another part of scoring is scoring features. So some scoring features that we want to keep in mind is prerequisite tasks. Prerequisite tasks, prerequisite class or whatever, is something you have to do before you can unlock another thing, right? We have 3 examples. So the one you guys will most be familiar with is the 2024 game, Crescendo. That one, it wasn't necessarily a task that enabled you to do another task, but scoring 2 in the amp allowed you to amplify the speaker, meaning the normal speaker's points became 2.5 times more, right? So it increased the number of points you get by doing another task. In 2020, scoring 29 balls in teleop in the power port allowed you to unlock a control panel task. So this was a different task that was on the field. You couldn't touch it, or I mean, you could touch it, it wouldn't do anything until you scored 29 balls, and then you could spin it and you could play around with it and then get some more points that way. And actually, doing the control panel task allowed you to get to the next stage. So once you got to a certain point, you had to be able to do that task. And then in 2019, that's we came to before, these hatches, which is these yellow discs, were your prerequisite tasks. And so if you didn't put in your hatches before you put in the orange balls, which is called the cargo would just roll out, as you can see in this first port right here. And so this would roll out unless there was a hatch panel, a disc right here. And so you could be the best cargo robot in the world, you could have the 3 best cargo robots in the world, but if you don't have a robot that can do hatches, then there was a maximum number of points your alliance could get. The second feature we want you to think about always is point density. So point density is, simply put, it's points per second. So based on this action I'm going to take, how long will it take, and how many points is that, and how many points per second is that. If you look at point density, then some tasks might be way more point dense. So endgame tends to be point dense because it's like 30 points and it's something you can do in like 10 seconds. But obviously that's restricted because you can only do it during endgame. But point density is a great way, very simple way to figure out what kind of cycles or what kind of game pieces are most point dense and quote unquote most worth your time. We're gonna next be transitioning to how you get points. So previously we were talking about how the overall game is. Now we're going to be talking about how you get points. So the most simple and easy and the most standard, I guess, vanilla way to get points is your linear scoring. The linear scoring is your basic, you do one action and you get a set number of points. There's 2 main types of it. The first one is a single opportunity per cycle. So a single opportunity means you can hold 1 game piece at a time. This will be games like 2023 or 2019, where you could only hold 1 game piece at a time, versus multiple opportunities. So multiple opportunities, these are games where you can hold multiple game pieces at a time. And we say opportunities because you could be holding 2 balls or 5 balls, but if you miss all of them, that's 0 points still. If you only make half of them, that's only half the points. And so when you have a single opportunity game, you want to make sure that you're making every single opportunity count, versus if you have multiple opportunities, now you have some more options. Maybe you're trying to maximize the number of cycles, and you just, as long as you reach some threshold of accuracy, then you're good enough. Or maybe you try to make each one as accurate as possible, but maybe you take longer overall. And so that's a trade-off, a design trade-off that you have to make later on. Some other types of scoring, step scoring. So step scoring is the game kind of withholds points from you until you perform a certain task. So in 2017, the rotors gave you a flat 40 points. I think it's the 40 points. And so the game kind of withholds points from you until you complete these certain tasks. The last thing is scoring bonuses. So a bonus, it's like getting a bonus at work. It's you do a task and that task either gives you extra points for a different type of task, or gives you a multiplicative bonus. So multiplicative bonus is it's double the points, or for a certain number of seconds, this is worth X amount of points. In 2018, this was a really fun game because you could submit these cubes to the vault, and then you could do like power-ups. So power-ups were like basically little superpowers that you could give your alliance for a little bit of time. And then one of the things you could give was, you artificially get ownership of a certain game piece. And so for however many seconds, you get ownership. Or you get double points from whatever field element you chose. In 2024, again, the amp gave you bonus for the normal speaker notes, right? So once you amped, if you couldn't capitalize off your 10-second amp timing, then you weren't doing anything with it. But if you could capitalize off of it, then it could really snowball. And then another bonus is just your straight additive bonus. So in 2023, I think each cone and cube wasn't worth a lot of points, but the links, which is if you put 3 horizontally, those were worth a lot of points. And so being strategic about where you scored given the time you had, and the capabilities of your alliance, that became pretty important in 2023. Okay, now we're gonna transition to the different segments of a game. So I think everyone knows autonomous, tele-op, and endgame. So autonomous is the first 15 seconds of the match. Usually it's just a value multiplier, so you do the same tasks as in tele-op, but maybe it's worth a little bit more points than it would be in tele-op. Sometimes it's just normal addition, so just plus 1 points. In those kinds of years, teams sometimes think, oh, it's not worth as much because it's plus 1 point. In 2023, there is a maximum number of places you can score, and so there's a trade-off there. I think it's always worth it to do autonomous as much as possible, but that's another thing that teams consider. And then the last thing is your end game contribution. So in 2023, if you completed certain things during autonomous, it contributed to your end game, and so it made your end game easier. It was balancing on the switch during autonomous. The end game, this is the last 30 seconds of your tele-op period, and this usually unlocks a certain scoring system. And so the five main types of endgame tasks is the single or dual task. This is do this task. It's pretty simple. In this picture, in this left picture, this is a 2019 game. You had to climb on this podium. You could either be on this bottom red level, or this bottom level, the second level, or this third level, and you got a certain number of points based on that. The second type is stage tasks. So stage tasks means you could do one task and then do the next and then the next. Obviously, you could skip some of the steps, but in 2022, the end game was kind of like monkey bars, and so you grab on to the lowest rung, you get however many points, and then you get increasing number of points as you go higher up the rungs. In 2018, there was an assisted task, so there was only space for one robot to climb, so you needed a buddy, basically. That's where the buddy climb was. That's this right here, so 254 is with their buddy right here. And then in 2011, this was a fun one. It's called an ordinal endgame. Basically, you had these little mini robots that shimmied up these poles. The way the endgame scored there was who can get to the top the fastest, and the first place got like 30 points or something, 40 points. Second place got a little less, third place got a little less, so on and so forth. So it was how fast you can complete it. In the past like 5, 6, 7 years, it hasn't really been about how fast you can complete the end game, and it's just been what do you have at the end. And so if you can complete your end game task really fast, you have more time to just score normally, versus if it takes you a while, then you might have to allocate some more time. And then there are games like 2015 where there is no end game. I don't think that's going to happen, so I wouldn't really worry too much about that. Alright, the next thing is ranking points. So ranking points are crucial to your rank, as the name implies, at the competition. You have like 30-40 teams at a competition. You need to be able to rank them from 1 to 40 for the alliance selections. And so the ways you always get ranking points is a win and a tie. A win gets you 2 ranking points, and a tie gets you 1 ranking point. That's always been the case. And in different years, you'll have 2 other tasks. that you can do ranking point that you can complete and you can get ranking points with. Usually one is endgame related and usually one is teleop related, and usually one of them, at least one of the ranking points will require at least 2 robots participation. Some other bonus achievements we can think of is cooperation. So in 2024, we had this cooperation thing where if you both, sacrificed 1 note in the amp, then the threshold became lower, and so that made your ranking points easier to achieve. And the other type, which is pretty common, is your threshold ranking points. So if you reach a certain number of scoring objectives, then you get a ranking point. For example, in 2019, which is this picture right here, if you filled up this rocket, so this was 6 cargo balls, this orange balls, and 6 hatch panels, then you could get a ranking point. So yeah, that was it for the scoring systems. Does anyone have any questions of anything I covered? And feel free to just unmute and go, because I'm not gonna get out of presentation mode. Everyone good? Okay. Alright. The next thing we're gonna be talking about are the game elements. So the game elements, there's 2 main things. The first thing is your game pieces, and the second thing is your field elements. We'll talk about the game elements first, the game pieces first. So the first thing is you have the single element games, which you've talked about. You have these examples right here. And you have multiple element games. So 2023, 2019, and so on. I'm not gonna describe all of them, but you can kind of tell what they are. For multiple element games, a big goal is to try to find a mechanism that can manipulate both game pieces in one mechanism. So in this purple cube and this yellow cone, this was from the 2023 game, there was a mechanism, manipulator style, that could grab both of them with the same mechanism, right? In 2019, that was the same case. In 2015, it was the same case, which is this green can and this yellow toad. This made things pretty simple, or a lot simpler for the teams that were able to figure that out, because that meant you only had to make one manipulator, and it could do both tasks. Now, in some years, that's not possible. Like in 2017, these yellow balls were called fuel, and it was these hard little plastic balls. Those were meant to be shot, and these yellow gears were meant to be placed, and so you couldn't really use the same mechanism for those two, but other games you can. Now for 2025, the hint is that there's going to be 2 game pieces, and so that's going to be one thing we're going to be looking at as soon as we find out what the game pieces are we able to think of any ways where we could use one mechanism for these 2 pieces. All right. Now you have your game pieces. How do you acquire them into your robot? So there's 2 main ways that you do them. The first is ground pickup, and the second is loading station. If the ground pickup is pretty simple, it's on the ground. Now on the ground, there is a difference there. So once it's on the ground, do you care about the orientation of the game piece when it's on the ground? That's something you have to think about when you specify, oh, we want ground pickup, yes or no. If it's a ball, obviously it doesn't matter, but if you have, for example, a cone, do you care about what orientation it's going to be in? Are there going to be certain orientations that you say we'll pick it up in, but other orientations we won't, etc. So there's always a combination there. And then the second thing is loading station. So loading station is usually a field element that drops game pieces into the field or into the robot. And that's another thing you have to think about is, okay, do we want to line up the robot and take it from the loading station's mouth, or do we want to let it get on the ground and we'll pick it up from there? So that's another trade-off you have to make. And then obviously there are some loading stations where you just take it directly from the loading station. So in 2019, again, you can see in this bottom right picture, this is the loading station for the hatch panels. and so you would take it directly from the loading station there. A fun note about this loading station was that the loading station of this hatch right here was approximately the same height as the cargo bay right here that we had at the beginning. It was approximately the same height as here. And so if you were able to find that measurement out on kickoff, you could specify a range of motion that wasn't as large. So some teams made note of that. And then just a general note is that at higher levels of play, there's a lower chance of dropped game pieces because teams are just better at holding on to their game pieces. And so that could be another thing that you keep in mind when you say, oh, we want to do ground pickup in these locations. Right? The next thing is kind of relates to what I was saying before, is where do you pick up and where do you score? And so we want to look at the field here, usually, and you get a sense of what kind of functions we need to call for. The first thing is if the distance between where you pick up and where you score is large, and there's a high percentage that there's going to be missed shots or dropped game pieces, then it would be good to have ground pickup, because that means you're going to be able to shorten your cycle times by, instead of going all the way back, you're going to be able to get something that's missed or something that's dropped a lot closer to where you're going to score from. If there's certain pathing that you have to do that's difficult or difficult to maneuver, doesn't have a lot of space, or has a long distance, then maybe you want a pass-through mechanism. A pass-through mechanism is you get a game piece from the front and score from the other side, so your game piece passes through the robot. And then the last discussion is swerve versus turret, or and/or turret. This is a debate that we've had in the past before. We'll still continue to have. Basically, it's if you have a swerve drive, do you need a turret? Do you not need a turret? There's two main ways, or two main things to consider. The first one is where do you want to intake from? So if you want to pick up on multiple sides, maybe having a swerve is useful and you don't need a turret, or vice versa. And then the scoring is the same thing, right? Do you want to score on the same side that you picked up from, on the opposite side, on any side, etc.? And then the third thing is defense. So if you're getting defended and you have a swerve drive, then you can just focus solely on getting to wherever you can shoot, and then the turret can do the rest of the work for you, versus needing to orient yourself so that you're not getting pushed and you can aim. Now, of course, having a turret and a swerve does increase your complexity, and so that's something you have to think about. In this presentation, you're going to have certain case studies, basically lessons from our team in the past. So I'm going to be roasting our old robots and our old decisions, basically. In 2019, this was the Deep Space game that you can see right here. We did not need a pass-through mechanism, and I'll explain it later on. I have an example, but it's like 2 or 3 slides down. But we didn't need a pass-through mechanism. We thought we did. We built a robot that had a wide enough elevator and a wide enough intake that it could pass through the robot. Ended up not needing it. The reason was that in this game, you couldn't go on the other side of the field to score. So you were stuck on your half of the field if you were scoring, which meant your distance between the cycles was not that long. And your pathing made it so that you had enough space to maneuver around. It added a lot of complexity to the robot, and it was one of the reasons why the robot was so complicated as it was. The next thing we want to talk about is meta evolution. So the competition gets released in January. You have your first competitions at the end of February with your week 0 events. Then you have 6 weeks of competition after that. And then you have your championships. And over time, there's going to be a lot of strategies that become popularized, don't become popular, certain types of robots that become more prevalent, etc. And so we're going to go through a few examples. We're actually going to start from reverse chronological order, or chronological order. So we're going to start from 2017. In 2017, the fuel, the small little balls, that was worth like a third of a point, but you could carry like 100 at once. So because you weren't getting a lot of points uh, for each ball that you shot at the beginning stages, and when people were a lot worse, people tended to focus on gears. But then once everyone started being able to do gears, how accurate you could score fuel became the differentiating factor. And so teams that clued into that and didn't have the capability to focus on both at the same time from the beginning were able to focus on the gear at the beginning and then shift to fuel later on. And I have an example of that later on. But those teams were very successful in making good use of their resources. In 2019, this is the same thing. The hatch was seen as the more difficult game piece because the other one was just a giant, dodgeball, and so most people could figure out how to grab that. But the hatch was more difficult, and so people who could do hatches in earlier weeks, it was really valuable because a lot of teams couldn't do it, and so the teams who could do it were very valuable. Or if you could do it, if you were very good at it, you became a lot more valuable. Obviously, as time went on, everyone started being able to do both game pieces, and so that became not as important. But if you were trying to qualify for championships or whatever, towards the beginning, that was super important. In 2022, accuracy and cycle speed mattered a lot at lower levels, and this sounds kind of obvious to say, but in higher level games, when the competition became difficult, you might intentionally try to get more difficult balls earlier on so that they came back as easier balls. I'll have more example of that later on. But when you weren't playing at that high level, if you were just playing at a normal regional, you just wanted to score fast and quickly and accurately. In 2023, the cube launcher was a meta evolution that arose throughout the season, because people weren't doing that at the beginning. But as Supercharge came in, as people started to realize, oh, these things can actually get shot from a relative distance, people started doing that. And then again in 2024, that high angle horde shot over the stage became more common as teams showed footage of them doing that. And it wasn't very difficult to implement for a lot of teams, and so that became a function that a lot of teams added later on throughout the season. Another thing we really want to look at is the field and how we can creatively interpret the rules. And so there's a very famous example in FRC. It's the momentary control, or the control rule. Control is, how do you define control, right? How long am I gripping something? Am I gripping something? Am I in contact with it? Am I actively changing the direction of something? And so that the definition of control changes every single year. But momentary control was defined as less than 3 seconds in 2022. And so that meant if you were, not holding it for less than 3 seconds, then you weren't controlling that game piece. And that meant you can control 3 game pieces rather than 2. So there's things like that where you can gain a competitive edge by interpreting the rules creatively. And the Q&A is there to assist you. Of course, if you think you've stumbled on a loophole, don't just submit it to the Q&A. Talk to us, obviously. And then another case study from our team, this one which is positive, is the 2017 climb. So in the 2017 climb, you could bring your own rope to climb. And so, but what does rope mean? Some teams interpreted it as this webbing that was frayed on the ends. This meant that you could use pretty much a drum cylinder with Velcro wrapped on it, and then that just spins and wraps around the drum, and that's your climb. And so we saw other teams do that and copied it, and it worked great. Very simple. And we wouldn't have been able to do that if we interpreted, rope to mean Dyneema, or rope to mean twine, or whatever it is. So when you get the game, the game rules, try to think about what does this mean. And there are certain things that'll come up. Obviously, the rules that are like, oh, you can hold more than you cannot hold more than 4 game pieces. Don't try to logical way to holding 6 that usually will get patched out if there even is a gap in the first place. Okay, so this is 2019, the game I was talking about before. But as you can see, if you are blue, you are only allowed to be on one side of the field unless you're a defender. But if you're a defender, you can only have one robot of the opponent color on the opposite side. And so we're just gonna imagine we're not defending, or we already have a defender, you're on your side of the field, right? These distances were not that long, and you had enough space to maneuver, which meant that picking up dropped hatch panels on the floor or picking up dropped cargo, dropped game pieces in general, was not that important. Just because you could just go back and get another one. It was just faster to keep that straight line, right? The second thing was isolated scoring lanes. So what I mean by a scoring lane is you can draw these like quadrants or imaginary lines on an FRC field, and you can kind of see, because straight lines are great, right? Straight lines are easy for a person to drive on, easy for a driver to follow, and easy for an alliance to organize your head around. And so because you had such isolated scoring lanes in this game, I mean, you could literally divide the field into this horizontal line. Okay, one team takes the bottom half, another team takes the top half, and we don't ever see each other until the end game. You could do that, which meant that you had a lot of space to maneuver yourself, which again led to decrease the need for pass-through scoring. I keep harping on this, but these conclusions were things that we found out at the end of the season, and if we could have thought of these at the beginning, it could have saved us a lot of trouble, and we could have just told ourselves why, we don't need to be doing this, right? So talking more about the field-oriented lineup is what it sounds like is aligning yourself to an element on the field because it's easy to square yourself up against something to score or to do a certain action. So we'll go again in chronological order because technology evolves. So teams in like 2017 just didn't have as good technology in 2024. Like Vision came out in 2018, something like that. Limelight came out in 2018. So in 2017, I don't have a picture here, but teams lined up with the field. So this was to be like the sides or a corner to shoot the field, because that was just a lot simpler. You had a consistent place to score from, consistent shot every time. 2020 was the same thing. You would drive up pretty much, or teams like us drove straight up right in front of that goal, and then maybe backed up a little bit and then shot. If you knew, we're gonna run into the wall and then back up 5 meters or however many, then you had a consistent shot there. In 2022, 254, one of the best teams in the world, they won world championships that year. They could shoot from anywhere. They could shoot while moving. They had 2 intakes. They had a turret and a swerve. Like, they were incredible. But what they did was a lot of times they would line themselves up with the sidewall right here of the field. And the reason why they did that, even though they could, run and gun if they wanted to, the reason why they did that was they wanted to have a consistent shooting pattern, and it also allowed them to counteract defense because there were only 2 directions that someone could come from that would affect your shot. And so teams that even if they did have that capability to shoot from anywhere or shoot on the fly, still wanted to line up with the field, because if you're wedged up against the wall, right, you can only get pushed either front or backwards. If you get pushed into the wall, then it's not doing anything. And then in 2024, we had the speaker right here. There were 3 sides to the speaker, and so it was, as the competition went on, it became important that you be able to shoot from all sides of the speaker if you're shooting up against the speaker. But shooting from against the speaker was, still a very valid strategy, even though you could theoretically shoot from further away. Even more things about the field. So choke points. If you've played games or whatever, choke points are places where you know, maneuverability is restricted. So this example right here, this is the 2020 game. This is looking from the side of the field. So we had this trench. It was this like a little tunnel. It was like 2 feet tall, and this was a protected zone, but you know, you had this height limit, right? And then you had these aluminum bars in the middle of the field that made it difficult to traverse, or you know, it would decrease your field a lot, or your speed a lot, sorry. And then the other side was the opponent's trench, which is a protected zone. And so you had a lot of these choke points in this game. 2023 is another example where you had multiple choke points. I'll show an example of that later on. But choke points are places you can't go or might be difficult to go, and you have to deconflict with your alliance and with the opponents how you're going to load your game pieces, how you're going to score, and how you're going to traverse. These are all static choke points, so you know, it doesn't move. But in 2018, the scale in the middle of the field was a variable height, right? Because if it's tipping towards you, then that's going to block your path a little bit. If it's tipping towards the opposite side, it's going to be, you know, in the way over there. So there was a little bit of variability there. But generally, like, the field doesn't move a lot because it's difficult to do that from just a physical standpoint. Like in 2016, you had these different changing field pieces, but that was a nightmare for volunteers, so that probably won't happen again. So back to 2018, on our team in 2018, we said we need to fit under the scale when the scale was tipped low. That requirement didn't really make sense in hindsight because you had space to go around it. So why would you need to restrict yourself to a certain height when you could just easily go around it? So I don't know why we gave ourselves that requirement, because I wasn't on the team back then, but we gave ourselves that requirement, and that made the design more difficult. Back to this example, this little tunnel you see right in front of you, this was the 2020 game, and this was the trench. And so we told ourselves we want to go under the trench, which made packaging very difficult. We said that it would be difficult for us to go over the rendezvous, so we want to be able to go under the trench. But we designed the drivetrain to be able to go over the rendezvous. And so we tried to do both things at once, and we set back our development for the drivetrain and for, you know, the overall robot architecture by a week, 2 weeks. And yes, you know, this was a protected zone. It was cool. It was you could get your balls from this spot right here behind the guy, and then run all the way across under the trench and then shoot. Like, in theory, it was great, but we restricted ourselves, and that made it difficult for us. And so I'm not saying it was bad that we went under the trench, or that, you know, it was bad that we made a drivetrain that could go over the rendezvous, but it just made everything a lot more complicated. And these were things that we didn't consider when we said let's do this or let's do that. We just said, oh, you know, seems good, let's do it. And then the last thing about the field is the effect you have on defense. So defense is a really important part of FRC because it's one of the only ways that you can prevent your opponents from scoring or scoring as much. And there's a few goals that you have during defense, and it depends on the game and it depends on the field. Depends on where you can go on the field. But for example, in 2023, this is the 2023 field right here. These lines that you can see marked in red and blue, these are protected zones for the team of that color. So in 2023, you can see it's a pretty flat, open field. And so, why does it say defending pickup? You were defending transit in 2023. You couldn't defend pickup. You were defending the transit paths. In 2019, you were defending where to score. So if you remember, it had those cargo ships and the rocket. If you just stood like monkey in the middle style in front of where your opponent was trying to score, it was difficult for them to score. And so that was a method of defense. In 2022, this is the 2022 field on the right here. So there's a lot of visual obstruction. There's this big, tower looking thing in the middle. You have these trusses on the side, right? You could trap your opponents in certain zones so that they couldn't get a lot of game pieces. And so yeah, there's just different ways of playing defense, and so it would be wrong to evaluate defense as one single object, right? You want to think about how can defense be used most effectively in this game, and what kind of defense are we playing. In 2024, we defended certain zones of the field. Another cool thing about the 2022 game, which I'll explain later. But the field layout matters a lot, right? So the field layout determines where you move to cycle. So this is the 2023 game again. You pick up your pieces from one of these 3 loading stations, and so you either enter from this side or you enter from this side, and you're always you exit from this side, right? And then you're always going to enter your scoring zones from one of these 2 locations. So highlighted in pink are the choke points. You can see the choke points because this is like a seesaw in the middle. It would take a lot of time to go over it. I mean, you can go over it if you wanted to, but it would take a lot of time, so a lot of teams just chose to avoid it. And then this gray thing was a wall. So you only had 2 ways in and 2 ways out. This meant that certain zones were a lot better to play defense in. So some teams played defense in the middle right here where there was commonality in paths. Some teams played defense around the protected zone and tried to skirt around it. Some teams tried to play defense around where teams would try to re-enter to score. And the other feature about this game was that if there was no defense, or if all 3 robots in the opponent lines were disabled, whatever it is, you had pretty straight scoring paths that were uninterrupted, and pretty linear. Very easy to just hit go, accelerate, get to the loading station, pick up your game piece, and then accelerate back all the way to wherever you were scoring. This meant that time spent picking up dropped game pieces was a waste of time. You could just ignore that and go back and just get another game piece, and that was another thing that you didn't have to adjust your robot to. You knew where it was going to be every single time. And especially cones that were dropped, you never knew what orientation it would be dropped in, right? So it could be facing towards you, it could be facing away from you, it could be facing at some wonky angle away from you. And teams that tried to fiddle with picking up dropped cones, such as us, that was a mistake because there was really no need to do it. Now, I'm not saying picking up cones from the ground was bad, because a lot of teams specified one set orientation that they wanted to pick up cones in. So 696 at SoCal Showdown, I remember, they picked up cones only when it was facing directly at the robot. And so the cones facing directly at your robot, yes, we'll pick it up. And that's how they made use of the cones during auto. But besides that, they just didn't bother with cones that were dropped on the ground. And I think that was the right call as well. All right. Strategic dependencies. This is the last big section. So does anyone have any questions on anything related to the field or anything I covered up until now? Okay. All right.
Hey Con, I just got one thing on the 2019 field, Deep Space. Yeah, that one. So one of the things with the no pass-through mechanism on this, because you'd think, right, short field cycle, a pass-through would be awesome because it really cuts down as a fraction of the cycle. The turn time is a higher fraction of your cycle time. when you have a shorter cycle. But because there's no linear relationship between any of your scoring zones and any of your pickup zones, building a pass-through mech is really hard. Like if you look at all the places you can pick up any scoring piece, all the places you can dump it off for points, none of them are in a straight line, meaning you're going to have to turn somewhere along the way anyway. So that's really one of the reasons why we don't see pass-through mechanisms in this game compared to in Power Up. The game pieces and the scoring locations were short cycles and in a straight line, which made the pass-through really overpowered when 254 did it.
Yeah, so what Holden's talking about is in 2018. Imagine the top green square was where you score, and the bottom green square was where you got balls from. And like, let's say you could drive on here. So a part of the game was literally if you had a robot that could sit in the middle and then pick up from one side, score on the other, pick up from one side, score on the other, then that was you pretty much barely had to move, and you could score a ton of game pieces. And so I think part of the reason why we decided to go for something like that in 2019 was we saw that the year before and thought it was good. But yeah, so you have to be able to analyze the field really well, because not everything applies just because it looks similar, right? Okay, 2022. So this is one of my favorite games. Probably biased because it was my senior year, but the basic premise of this game was that you have 11 balls of your color, so blue or red, and then 11 balls of the opponent color. You can only hold up to 2 balls at once, not of a specific color, right? So you could hold one of the opponent, you can hold up to 2 of the opponent colors, and I think across the alliance you could only hold up to 2 of the opponent colors. So if you had a robot on your team holding 2, let's say you're blue, then red balls, then the opponents have 9 balls to play with total. The way the scoring worked in this game was the field piece. This was truly an unlimited scoring game. So you shoot these balls into this hub in the middle right here. I had a picture right here, right? So you shoot the balls into this hub and then it rolls out. There were 2 goals, the top and the bottom. 90% of teams scored in the top. So we'll only, when I say scored, I mean the top one. But they would score and then would roll out and get reintroduced back in the field. So it would get reintroduced, but you never really knew where it would go. You never really knew how far it would go on the field, where it would end up, where it would stop. And these balls generally, bounced relatively well. So this is a theory, the ball flow theory that Team 254 came up with. Basically, they found or theorized that number one, balls will be scattered towards the edges of the field if they were left ungathered. And if you think of that, that makes sense, right? It gets reintroduced to the field, it might teeter around in the middle right here, but then you'll get bounced away, or slowly your momentum can carry you towards the edges of the field. So that's postulate number 1. Number 2 was if you shoot a ball and then you miss that shot, so you overshoot or you undershoot, then that'll also push balls away towards the edges of the field, right? That makes sense. Third was that it was worth getting these high cost balls. So by high cost balls, it means what balls are easy to get and what balls are hard to get for your alliance. Green is easy and red is hard, right, in this diagram. So if you're blue right here, the balls in this green area were easy to get, but the balls in the yellow area were a little bit harder. And then the red was very difficult or much harder. They said that it was worth it to get those high cost balls. So the balls in the red zones earlier on, so that they don't just sit there wasting their lives away. They actually get picked up and then they'll reappear, or there'll be a higher chance that they reappear as lower cost balls. And to kind of explain the cost of balls, so the green areas are green because they're easy to see. So he says your team right here, so you're standing in one of these 3 locations. it's pretty easy for your driver to be able to see these locations and maneuver to get them. Around the edges, it's a little harder because it's you have less visibility, and you have to approach the game piece at a certain angle. And then behind the hub, the hub is pretty tall, as you can see right here. It's kind of tall, so it's kind of difficult to get it on the edges right here, but you can kind of see it, and then the red is very difficult. The red is very difficult because it's directly blocked by your line of sight, and that led to some interesting strategies. And then finally, right in front of you, right underneath you was actually pretty hard because you have to look directly underneath you, and you can't because there's like a table and stuff. So unless you're super tall, then it's kind of hard to see right below you. So this made for some interesting conclusions. The first was that the value of this ball flow theory changed depending on your level of competition. When you didn't have as difficult or high level of competition, it didn't really matter. Like, this theory entirely didn't really matter because you had such a difference in shooter accuracy and cycle times that you just you were never gonna catch up in the first place. Even if you worked on the higher cost balls, if you just couldn't shoot as much, you just wouldn't catch up. So, we like to say in strategy, like, we want to try to get an advantage, however slight. But sometimes you're just mechanically limited, right? But at higher levels, at champs, ball flow became really critical because robots and their capabilities were way less differentiated. So the things that these robots could do were really similar, and so you had to be able to differentiate yourself. And that one of the ways you could differentiate yourself was going for these high cost balls, because there was this element of randomness in the game, and you were trying to control that element of randomness. The second thing that ball flow kind of encouraged was indiscriminately picking up cargo. So cargo or balls, there's red and blue balls, right? But you can only, you can shoot opponent balls, you'll just score for the opponent team, but one thing that certain teams did was they would just pick up any ball they saw. Instead of being like, we're blue, so we're gonna look specifically for blue balls, they just said, we're just gonna go to the nearest ball. And then they had a color sensor in the robot, and they said, if I'm blue and the robot, if I'm blue and the ball is red, then I'm just gonna eject it. If I'm ejecting it, I'm usually ejecting it towards the outer edges of the field, which makes it more difficult for the opponents to get. And I didn't have to think about, is this a red or a blue ball? I just have to go towards any ball. And so having that capability was, another step, and another iteration that a lot of teams didn't have, in their first region or their second regional, but towards the end of the season, they were able to integrate or add to the robot. And then the last thing was defense related. So I mentioned earlier that your alliance could hoard up to 2 of the opponent color balls. Well, there was another way that you could hoard balls, which was hide the opponent color balls into the areas where it would be difficult for them to get. So you saw some auto paths by teams as the season went on, where they would pick up an opponent colored ball during auto, and then they would gently roll it towards the other side of the hub where people couldn't see it. Or you would sometimes see teams gently roll a ball towards, right underneath the opponent's driver station so that they couldn't see it. And that effectively made it so that the opponents were playing with 7 balls or 8 balls or 6 balls or whatever, however many it was, which just which decreases the number of scoring chances the opponents have. And also there's a processing time, so once you score, it bounces around in the hub a little bit, and then it dribbles out, and then it bounces, and once it hits the ground, you're usually not going to be able to pick it up instantly, so you have to wait for it to settle a little bit, stuff like that. And those things really made a difference when you had such tight games. Alright, 2024. We're talking about strategic dependencies here, and I'm not sure if you've noticed, but I've transitioned to talking about the game as an alliance, right? So when Hold and I were discussing 2019, you know, we didn't need a pass-through mechanism. We didn't need to pick up these things from the ground. Those are individual decisions. But now we're talking more about thinking about the game as an alliance, because you're always playing a 3v3, right? Regardless of if your robots are good or bad or whatever it is, you're always playing a 3v3. And so you always want to consider your strategy in a 3v3 scenario. In 2024, there was a theory came up with by, I guess, Holden, called rock, paper, scissors. And rock, paper, scissors basically describes 3 different alliance compositions that were popular, that beat each other, kind of like how you play rock, paper, scissors. So some things about the 2024 game, which I think all of you guys are familiar, so I won't explain it. But one critical thing was taking advantage of the amp times, so it would make your speaker shots worth 2.5 times. This meant that you could assign specific roles to robots on your alliance, so that they focused on one task, which made them a lot, more efficient at that task. And then second, you could gamble your scoring with hoarding. So you could hoard, you could choose to not. By hoarding, I mean you could choose not to score certain game pieces until you had that amp time, until that 2.5 times point value multiplier was active, and then you would shoot a bunch in short succession so that you maximize the amount of points you get. And again, with the level of competition thing, this really only mattered if your alliance could take advantage of the amp timing, right? So you could hoard, but if the guy shooting your nodes was really slow and he could only shoot 2 during the 10-second window, then it didn't really make much of a difference. And so at lower levels of competition, the triple cycling strategy was most effective, usually made more sense. And then also the field design made defense in certain areas very effective, which I will explain right here. So to quickly explain the rock, the paper, and the scissors. So the rock is the double hoard and the single offense. You have 2 robots hoarding, so shooting nodes across the field for that one singular robot to be able to score in the amp period, and you repeat that. This made it so that you were most efficient. You were taking max advantage of your amp times, and so your score might not go up as fast, but when it goes up really, by big strides, right? The rock beat the scissors. The scissors in this case was the triple cycling offense. So if you executed the double hoard strategy well, then you were most likely going to beat this triple cycling. Triple cycling was, simply put, 3 robots all going back and forth, doing their own thing. It had a high volume of notes, but maybe you would, score a speaker note that was worth only 2 points instead of 5 points. But this strategy didn't really care about that. We were just trying to get as many notes as possible. The scissors usually beat the paper, which is the 1 defense spot. The 1 defense spot would usually feature 2 scoring robots, so 2 cycling robots, and then 1 defense spot. That 1 defense spot had different areas they could play in. So the 2 main areas was they could make intaking difficult. So you could intake the nodes protected, but then getting out with the note to somewhere where you could shoot from, that either became difficult, or they could defend the single robot who was getting fed all these notes. And you could make it difficult for that robot to be able to execute their task efficiently in that 10-second window, because that in those 10 seconds you have to it's make it or break it, right? So that strategy was usually beat by a higher volume of notes because it's 3 versus 2 cycling, but they usually were able to beat this double hoard strategy because they didn't have anything to counter someone playing defense on them. I'm not going to mention the hybrids because hybrids are a mix of these, and I think hybrids are the way to go. But you had certain teams say, when you look at the opponents and they hit that amp time, we're gonna drop everything, we're gonna go defend them for 10 seconds and then come back. So there were teams who tried to merge these strategies as well. So you can see some features about this game. This is the 2024 game. I didn't change the title, but this is the 2024 game. The first thing is there's one single zone where you could intake from. It's down here, it's hidden by the text box, but there's only one place you could intake nodes from as a red line, so you had to go all the way across the field and intake it from this one specific corner. So that made it easy to defend a team trying to get out of it, and you can only shoot from past this blue line. And so if you wanted to intake and hoard for your team, you had to go somewhere here, which again was a choke point, right? These are physical structures on the field that act as choke points. The second thing was you had these full field cycles. So these long cycle paths made midfield defense options not as effective, because once a team exits into this open space in the middle right here, they could choose to go under the stage and up this way, under the stage and under the stage and out this way, under the stage and out this way, or all the way around. And so if you were playing monkey in the middle right here, you were not as effective. And so you wanted to pick some terrain to your advantage and play around that. And then the third thing was the hoarding zone. So the hoarding zone, usually teams would hoard somewhere in this area, this general area that I'm circling. It was relatively easy to defend because if there was only one scoring robot, you know, that they were kind of a sitting duck there. But again, your amp and your speaker is really close to each other, so if you weren't defended or if you could get around it effectively, then you had a lot of free reign. So looking at the field in 2024, there were a lot of options and a lot of different viable strategies and a lot of mix of strategies, which is why I really like this game strategically. But when you're looking at another game, think about similarities to fields you've seen, right? 2024, what does this field remind you of? Well, it reminds me a little bit of the 2023 field. There's a long cycle path. Okay, what did we learn from 2023 about long cycle paths? So you can draw some conclusions from there. You know, oh, there's certain protected areas that we can't go in, or be dangerous to go in. What is that similar to? And so once you start building up this repertoire of former games, it's a good thing to have. The last section we have is strategic dependencies. So again, thinking about using your alliance partners, in 2023 you had that seesaw that you would balance on in endgame. You couldn't do that yourself. Other teams had to kind of work with you, so that was important. 2020, you had this basically a coat hanger that you would climb on, and if this was level, it was free points, and so you could go up together as a group, or one person could try to adjust for the other person, for the other teams. If all three robots were climbing, right, just weight distribution wise, you would be level, but this was something that you had to work with your alliance partners. And then in 2019, you could use forks. So you could fork under a robot who had already climbed and then lift up from there. I'm gonna quickly give two examples of bad strategic dependencies. So this is us. This is 1678. They had a triple climb. It was very cool as a freshman. Looking back on it strategically, it was a gamble that they did, right? If it was an all or nothing gamble, it was either they climb alone or all three robots climb. And unless that second robot had a fork that they could just stick under 1678 and climb, which again might have been unlikely, or they had like a suction climb, it was an all or nothing gamble. Or if you had already deployed your forks and you were waiting, let's say we didn't make it on there in time, they would get no climb points, right? Because you'll be unbalanced. And so talking to them later on, they said it's a bad strategic dependency. They put too much into it, and so the lesson from this is it might look cool, but you have to think about, is this really worth it, right? 4201, our friends, in 2020 they built a self leveler, right? So they had this little wheel that rolled up and down and balanced it for them. It was cool, but you really didn't need to develop it. It didn't affect them, like they didn't perform worse because of it, but it wasn't a necessary function. And then our last section is just 2 slides, but it's iterating functions over time. So really want you guys to all know and keep in your head that driver practice has an outsized effect on robot performance. Driver practice, can come with just the drivetrain. Obviously, it gets better as there's more mechanisms to simulate the robot, but the first thing is having a solid drivetrain that works consistently early on in the season, and then being able to build on your functions as soon as possible. So how do you do that? You want to boil down your robot to its core functions and add on features later, or iterate features later. You want to get something out because something that works is a lot better than 3 or 4 things that doesn't work. And another rule, or another thing I want you guys to all remember, is people are not that good, especially early on. So in 2019 at Central Valley Regional, I think this was a week 2 competition. It was 3 to 4 cargo pieces, those orange balls, on average in the entire match. For across the whole regional, most teams did 3 balls, right? And if you think about it, that's like 30 seconds a piece. So ding ding ding, you only have, half the field to go on, really a quarter of the field, and you're taking 30 seconds per game piece. That's an incredibly slow amount of time, and I know this is like before caught swerve and everything, but every year if you look at the dip in performance in like week 1, week 2 events, and they slowly power up, if you can get good at 1 or 2 functions early on, it doesn't matter if you can't do everything. If you're good at 1 or 2 things, you'll be very competitive in those early weeks, and then you can build off of it later on. 2056, OP Robotics, Canadian team, very good team. They always build very simple, very effective robots. And so some of the things they did in 2019, they only picked up and scored from one side. So they would just turn their drivetrain, 180 degrees, if they need to score on the other side, and they said no ground pickup, right? Very simple. Or no ground pickup for hatches, actually. Sorry. In 2016, their intake and the shooter faced the same way, which was for top teams. They tried to have it face both directions. They said no, we're just gonna turn, right? They didn't try to make their shot unblockable, and they had pretty simple mechanisms for defenses. And in 2024, the intake and the shooter were on the same system, which made it, one big system, which has its advantages and disadvantages, obviously, right? Every simple mechanism has its advantages, disadvantages. Like if you have an intake and the shooter on the same system, there's some degree of separation you need there, and so, but they were comfortable with that design. And the way they scored into the amp, a lot of the top teams did this like chamfer design. They tried to bend the note. They didn't do any of that. They just went up and then scored in. So everything was very linear, very straight, very straightforward. And another fan of 2056 is Mr. Adam Hurd. He's a mentor on 254, but he used to be on 973, the Greybots, who won the World Championships in 2017. And so he, I'll say, religiously studies 2056. He's got a lot of inspiration from them. And so we're going to quickly look at 973's 2017 season and how they powered up throughout the season. So a little background on 973. They work out of a school. They don't work out of a NASA laboratory. They have great mentors, but it's not like they're 148 where they get sheet metal pieces on their doorstep first thing in the morning, right? So the thing they did that they focused on during 2017 was Adam reassessed every week a timed breakdown of a cycle, from week 0 to championships. He looked at how long parts of their cycle was taking and how long parts of other people's cycle were taking to figure out what he could improve on. So their first event was a week 2 event. They weren't that great, they weren't amazing. They were okay. They lost in the semifinals. They didn't qualify for champs. Not one mechanism was super great on the robot. So week 4, they said, none of our, so they looked at the time breakdown, and they said our mechanisms are okay. Like, our mechanisms are pretty good. We should use the 2 weeks we have to focus on driver practice. So for 2 weeks, they just focused on the gear cycle, specifically the gear cycle for driver practice, because Adam realized teams weren't great at gears. Being good at gears was going to qualify me for champs. So week 4 event, they did great on the gears. They qualified for champs. And then going between week 4 and champs, so they had 3-4 weeks to work on it. They saw what other teams in the area did to improve the shooter accuracy. And, for us, it would be Open Alliance, looking at RI3D, etc. For him, it was talking to other friends in the area. But either way, he saw what improvements they made. So he would talk to 971, he would talk to 254, he would talk to 1678, he would talk to all these teams, and he'd be like, oh, what did you do on your shooter? Oh, what did you do on your shooter? He wrote them all down, and then he looked at their matches to see, what changes did they make and how much did it affect their accuracy by. So he took all those lessons and he chose 4 or 5 of the best, most promising solutions. And then in their week 4 event, their shooting accuracy was around 60%. At champs, it was greater than 95%. And I realized I didn't show a picture of the 2017 game, but you had like hundreds of those little yellow balls and you were shooting a constant stream of them. And so being able to achieve such a high shooter accuracy was super good. And as we discussed before, gears were great early on, but having really good fuel mechanisms and accuracy was what won you the events. And so they won champs that year. And so that's kind of a breakdown of how 973 leveled up throughout the year. And that's a model that we could use as well to improve throughout the season. So yeah, that is the end of part 1 strategy. There is a part 2, but that is part of the design training, and so go talk to design for it. Cool. Does anyone have any questions or comments, things to add, things I missed up? Yeah.
Like, when you mean by like simplifying mechanisms, like how simple should like a mechanism be?
Sure. So
like, yeah.
Simple is a difficult thing to define because you're going to have trade-offs. So if you have your intake and shooter on the same system, for example, on the outside it might look simple, but you have but that one system, if it doesn't work well, then it's all or nothing, right? I guess to answer your question, there isn't any one definition that I can give you that's simple. I mean, so this is part of the 20, which slide was it? I guess the easiest definition of simplicity is a complexity index. So thinking about degrees of freedom, degrees of freedom is how you can move certain, what axes can you move on the robot. Usually per subsystem or a robot, lower is better, but there's different types of degrees of freedom, right? So there's like, you can have discrete versus variable positioning. Discrete means like, two positions, so like a piston, right? 2 positions versus an arm that can go extend to infinite number of positions. That's that degree that is one degree of freedom, but one is more complex than the other. You could have like rotary movement versus linear movement, and that's quote unquote 1 degree of freedom, but one could be a lot more complicated than the other. So I guess like trying to lower your degrees of freedom and trying to simplify the types of degrees of freedom you have is how I would say make a more simple robot. The other thing is lowering the states you need to have. So I think programming does like state machines and stuff, but states is basically like statuses of your robot. So if you have a catapult, then you need to lower the catapult arm, latch it down. You have to load whatever you're shooting, and then you have to launch it, and then now you have to reset. So that's like 4 or 5 actions you have to do. Versus if you just have a shooter flywheel, then it's just spin it up and then feed it in from the indexer, and then you're done. Or if you have a puncher, that's you have to bring the puncher back, load it, punch it. So that's 3. So I think lowering the number of states as well. And then finally reducing the number of game piece handoffs. So this is a picture of the 2023 robot. Yeah, this one. You had like a lot of handoffs that you didn't really need when you can only hold the 1 game piece. So that's another thing, where if you can decrease the number of handoffs or decouple the handoffs, could make your robot more simple. Yeah, I would say that's how you would do it.
All right. Also, for RPS, do you think that applied to other game strategies, or like, what do you think?
What's RPS?
Oh, rock paper scissors.
Oh, applying to other games?
Yeah, because like, is it just that 2024 was just like a unique enough game that rock paper scissors existed, or is it just like we could think about it more universally, like not as specific as ball flow theory?
So at least in the games since 2019, I don't think there's been a game where you have multiple viable strategies at a high level that could all work. Usually it tends to be like one or the other, and then it's like which team better executes. I mean, Olden might be able to find another game, but I haven't been able to think of another game that's had something where it's like beats itself up like in a nice little circle. I think part of it is because you have 2 scoring methods, but your amp makes your speaker a lot better. So you could choose to go one or the other. And timing was really critical. So that allows the defense to come in and like mess it up, right? Whereas if the timing wasn't as important, then like I think defense wouldn't be in this conversation. Because I don't know any other games that are like rock paper scissors.
Hey Con.
Yeah.
Can I just tag one small thing in there? So in like game theory, there's actually like terminology for this, and unfortunately I forget what it is right now. But basically in a lot of games you have one dominant strategy that everybody is always going to do all the time, because doing anything else is not worth it. So like in 2022, by the end we got to the ball flow theory thing that for the most part everybody has to do all the time. If you're not doing this, you're going to lose to a team that's doing it. If you're doing it and you're playing a team that's doing it, okay, you just got to do it better. And that's typically what we're looking for when we go through our ideal alliance strategy process to figure out what that dominant strategy is going to be, and then build ourselves around what we can play within our capabilities. For a game like 2024, there's a few options. It's either there's no dominant strategy, that the game is in fact so unique, especially like Khan mentioned with the timing, that kind of adds some value to defense that's not normally there. The game is so unique that there is no single dominant strategy, which is one possibility, or the other possibility is there is, and it's just none of these. So that does remain a distinct possibility.
Yeah, I remember when we were watching from the stands at Champs, I was a big advocate of hybrid, like 2 hybrid, 1 horde, I think, was my ideal. But I haven't seen a team like execute it super well. I mean, maybe like Chezzy or IRI, I didn't really watch those. But I am curious if like double hybrid would work better. We'll see. Yeah. Yeah, it's like I think most of the games. No, you go.
Well, I want to finish, and then I'm also gonna ask another question as well.
Okay, yeah. Ask your second question or third question.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because does pick and place affect like certain theories from working? Because like I feel like for 2024, like if it was a pick and place game, like could that theoretically happen in the same way? Because I feel like you can't defend a pick and place, like unless I'm proven wrong and there's like a time you could block a pick and place.
Are you saying is it more difficult to defend pick and place games?
Yeah, in a sense that, and how does that like affect like how would you think about the game? Because I'm thinking about
Okay, so my sense,
like how most pick and place was defended.
So
Yeah.
okay, so yeah, my sense for pick and place games is, so we've only had 2 pick and place games in recent history. I guess 2018 kind of, but that game was a wacky scoring system. Like 2019 and anything really before COD Swerve is hard to determine because everyone was like literally 2019 you could defend by saying I'm just gonna sit in front of this rocket and move like, this tiny radius, and you'd be actually a very effective defender, and then 2023 you couldn't defend any scoring. I think defense will always be viable. You just have to find like, you have to overlay, your the optimal scoring paths, and then see where it's best for you to play. And then also keep in mind, like, this is mirrored as well with your own alliance, so you want to make sure you're not getting in the way of your own alliance. Certain theories break down because of pick and place. I think a lot of times with pick and place games you're not allowed to launch game pieces above like a certain number of feet distance wise, so I think that makes it that everyone has to move. And then when everyone has to move, I think like it makes everything a little more simple. So I think teams tend to like go into a game of least mistakes versus like trying to innovate a lot strategy wise. But no, I think pick and place games, well, I think the games with the best strategy is a mix of both. But yeah, I mean strategically I think pick and place games probably have the least amount of strategy, because a lot of it just becomes execute the strategy or execute your functions best, I guess. Yeah, I guess you're kind of right.
Yeah, I can see that. Do you think pick and place, like, you know how in 2023 there were like protected zones, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you think there'll ever be non-protected zones for pick and place, or does that like kind of go against like a FRC game ethos?
So I think there will be protected zones or game obstacles because game design wants to make the field not like swerve drives just accelerating to the max in long straight lines. Like 2023 was terrible for that because it was you could accelerate and then just smash into the wall, right? So I think they've learned from that and they're gonna try to make it more difficult, whether that's like there's like a enemy protected zone right in front, so you have to like go around and you can't go as fast or something. But I don't think they'll get rid of protected zones, um, because protected zones like kind of force you to play a little more cautiously. I think, which is I think what they want, is that the game the field doesn't destroy itself.
Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Any other questions from anyone or things you had? All right. If not, then thank you all for coming and watching. Um, and I'm gonna stop the recording.